It was a typical Tuesday morning at the Greenville Municipal Courthouse. The docket was full of routine cases, parking violations, minor tax disputes, landlord-tenant issues. A quiet stream of citizens filed through the security scanners, took their seats, and waited for their names to be called. Everything moved like clockwork. That is, until Malcolm Reed stepped into the courtroom, just 4 minutes late. Malcolm, a calm, composed black man in his late 30s, walked in wearing a tailored navy suit, briefcase in hand. He offered a polite nod as he approached the front row, but before he could even sit, Judge Franklin Doyle, a stiff, stone-faced man with decades behind the bench, looked up from the bench and scowled. "Mr. Reed," Judge Doyle said loudly, "this court operates on discipline and punctuality. Do you think your time is more important than everyone else's?" Malcolm blinked, taken aback by the hostility. "Apologies, Your Honor. The traffic was rerouted due to construction." "Not my problem," the judge interrupted, his voice sharp, cold. "That kind of excuse doesn't fly here. I'm issuing a $1,000 fine for contempt of court." The room went still. A few rows back, a middle-aged white man who had arrived 10 minutes late for a zoning dispute was never even scolded. Several court observers looked between him and Malcolm, clearly noting the hypocrisy, but no one said a word. Malcolm did not raise his voice. He didn't challenge the ruling. Instead, he lowered his head, nodded once, and quietly took his seat. But inside, something shifted. Because what Judge Doyle didn't know was that Malcolm Reed wasn't just another black man in a courtroom. He was a federal civil rights prosecutor, trained to spot patterns of injustice, and now he had just lived one. And this moment, this insult, it wasn't the end, it was the beginning. If you've ever witnessed a double standard, if you've ever seen someone punished not for what they did but for who they are, comment the number 7 below. Because this isn't just a story about a courtroom. It's about what happens when someone turns humiliation into a mission for justice. Malcolm Reed sat quietly in the back row of the courtroom, the crisp $1,000 fine still echoing in his ears like a gavel that never really landed. He didn't protest. He didn't raise his voice or throw accusations. He simply observed, watching Judge Franklin Doyle move to the next case as if nothing unusual had happened. To anyone else in the room, Malcolm's silence may have looked like defeat, but for Malcolm it was a calculated pause. He wasn't just a bystander in the justice system, he was part of it. And he had learned long ago that sometimes the most powerful move is not a rebuttal, but a question asked at the right time. After court adjourned, Malcolm didn't leave immediately. Instead, he stood outside, notebook in hand, jotting down every detail he could remember. Case names, arrival times, the judge's comments. The more he thought about it, the more something felt wrong. The fine wasn't just about being late. It had been personal, targeted, and he couldn't ignore the pattern he had seen. White defendants arriving late and being met with a shrug, while he was publicly humiliated and punished without discussion. That night, Malcolm sat at his kitchen table, reviewing the incident again and again. What if this wasn't an isolated mistake? What if Judge Doyle had a history of biased rulings, subtle to the eye but clear in the data? Malcolm didn't want revenge. What he wanted was clarity and justice. So quietly and methodically, he began to build a file, not just about his own experience, but about every case Judge Doyle had presided over in the last 5 years. He requested public records, compared sentencing patterns, flagged inconsistencies, and what started as a moment of frustration soon became a mission. He wasn't angry, he was awake. Because the problem wasn't just one judge in one courtroom, it might be a symptom of something larger, something systemic. And Malcolm Reed had just become the one man willing to follow the trail, to ask the questions no one else had dared, and to find out just how deep the imbalance of justice really went. By day, Malcolm Reed continued his work as a respected federal civil rights prosecutor. He attended meetings, reviewed case files, mentored junior attorneys. But by night, and every spare moment in between, he was building something entirely different, a silent investigation that no one saw coming. The courtroom humiliation had lit a fire inside him, not fueled by pride or ego, but by principle. Malcolm had dedicated his life to upholding justice, and now he had been personally subjected to the very injustice he fought against. He wasn't going to let it slide, not because it happened to him, but because he knew it had likely happened to many others who didn't have the power to fight back. With quiet precision, Malcolm filed Freedom of Information Act requests. He gained access to public court transcripts, sentencing records, and time-stamped attendance logs for Judge Franklin Doyle's cases over the past 10 years. Using an encrypted database, he began analyzing the data, looking for patterns in fines, bail decisions, and sentencing disparities. The results were chilling. Defendants of color, particularly black men, were fined more frequently, given harsher sentences for identical offenses, and reprimanded more often for courtroom behavior. Meanwhile, white defendants were routinely given lighter outcomes, even in cases with more serious charges. But statistics weren't enough. Malcolm needed human voices. He began discreetly reaching out to former defendants, court reporters, and public defenders who had worked under Judge Doyle's bench. One by one, stories trickled in, accounts of quiet injustice, scoldings delivered with condescension, and rulings that just didn't feel right. And all the while, Judge Doyle had no idea that the man he belittled was now holding a magnifying glass to his entire career. Malcolm didn't rush. He moved with discipline. He wasn't building a complaint. He was building a case, one that would not be swayed by emotion, but anchored in undeniable fact. Because Malcolm Reed wasn't just seeking accountability for himself. He was preparing to expose a system of quiet abuse that had festered for years behind the walls of a courtroom. And he was the last person Judge Doyle should have underestimated. Malcolm Reed had the data. The numbers didn't lie. The disparities in Judge Doyle's rulings were alarming, but numbers alone wouldn't stir change. He needed testimony, a voice from inside the courthouse walls, someone who had seen it all unfold, not from the outside looking in, but from behind the bench where silence often meant survival. That voice came from an unlikely ally, Mrs. Helen Carter, the court's longtime clerk. She was in her early 60s, soft-spoken but sharp, with a memory like a filing cabinet and a reputation for integrity. She had worked under Judge Doyle for nearly 2 decades, watching the justice system grind forward day after day, case after case. When Malcolm reached out to her through a trusted contact, she hesitated, not out of fear, but out of weariness. "I've seen it all," she told him, her voice low. "And for years I told myself I was just doing my job. But after what he did to you, I can't stay quiet anymore." What she shared changed everything. Mrs. Carter revealed personal notes, private logs she'd kept for years. They weren't official records, but they were damning. She had documented moments when Judge Doyle dismissed motions without reading them, mocked defendants behind closed doors, and handed down disproportionate sentences based on race and income level. Most troubling of all, she had flagged repeated language Doyle used in private, phrases that revealed his deep-seated bias. He used to say, "Some people just don't understand order unless you hit them hard the first time." You can guess which people he meant, she said, her expression tight with regret. Malcolm listened carefully, never interrupting. This wasn't just a breakthrough, it was validation. Her testimony, combined with the data, transformed Malcolm's quiet investigation into a powder keg of accountability. He now had the voice of someone who had witnessed the injustice, not as a victim, but as an insider. Mrs. Carter agreed to go on record, under one condition, that the fight wouldn't end with Judge Doyle, but would challenge the entire system that protected him. Malcolm promised her it would, because now the silence was broken, and the truth was no longer his alone to carry. Weeks after his humiliating trial, Malcolm Reed was no longer the man who sat silently in the dock. He was back where he belonged, a veteran federal prosecutor who had led dozens of civil rights investigations across the country. But this time, he wasn't investigating a cop or prosecuting a financial fraud ring. His target was the very courthouse where he'd been wronged, specifically Judge Franklin Doyle. After gathering enough preliminary evidence from court records, silent testimony from Mrs. Carter, the court clerk, and internal witness transcripts, Malcolm decided to launch the strongest blow, a full-blown legal search warrant from the federal office. Subpoena for all Greenville court records for the past 10 years. Court transcripts, statistics on court costs, fines, and detentions. transcripts of internal emails from Judge Doyle to staff complaint reports from public defenders. Video recordings of courtroom activity all must be delivered within 7 working days. As soon as the warrant was issued, the Greenville courthouse was shaken. Some court employees were nervous, others relieved. People who had been silent out of fear now began to contact Malcolm, ready to tell what they had witnessed but had never dared to say. Among them was Daniel Hayes, a judicial police officer at the courthouse who worked under Judge Doyle for more than 8 years. In a private conversation, Hayes said, "I always felt like something was wrong, but I had no right to question it. Thank you for speaking up." At the same time, Malcolm got the green light from his boss, Natalie Brooks, who now holds a high position in the Federal Department of Justice. "We will support you fully," she said, "not just because you are outraged, but because this system needs to be cleaned up." What started as a small court case has now become a federal investigation, potentially exposing a system of bias, intentional discrimination, legitimized in the name of law. The press got involved. Headlines appeared on national news sites. Federal prosecutor issues warrant to investigate Greenville local court. Is justice really fair? The offended stand up and turn the system upside down. Malcolm, however, did not give interviews. He did not speak to the press. He let his records speak for him, because at this point, silence is no longer acceptance. It is strategic. If you feel Malcolm's actions were necessary, if you believe that justice must be fair to all, comment 7 below to let us know you're with this story. If you think he went too far, comment 0. We respect all perspectives. And please share the video so that more people understand. When justice is compromised, the truth must stand up to protect it. For weeks, rumors had circulated in legal circles. Whispers of a federal investigation into a small-town judge. Hints of racial bias, unexplained sentencing patterns, and whistleblowers from inside the courthouse. But no one expected what came next. Not the scope, not the scale, and certainly not the man who would stand before the cameras and speak the truth with unwavering calm. It happened on a crisp Thursday morning outside the very courthouse where it all began. The media had been tipped off the night before, just enough to send local reporters scrambling and major news outlets dispatching their national crews. Microphones lined the podium. A dozen cameras rolled as citizens gathered, some out of curiosity, others with quiet hope. Then, without escort or introduction, Malcolm Reed stepped forward. He wore no robe, no badge, no protective armor, just a gray suit, the look of a man who had carried something heavy for far too long. His voice when he spoke was measured, director, and every word landed like a strike of lightning. "For the past several months," he began, "my office has conducted a comprehensive civil rights investigation into judicial practices in Greenville County. What we discovered is not just disturbing, it is systemic." He laid out the facts with clinical precision. Over 70% of the harshest sentences under Judge Franklin Doyle's jurisdiction were handed to defendants of color. White defendants with identical or more serious charges routinely received lighter penalties. Multiple internal complaints from public defenders had been ignored or buried. Recorded statements from staff confirmed a pattern of racial bias in private conversations and courtroom behavior. Then came the shocker. Malcolm displayed a set of printed emails and handwritten notes, entered into evidence, where Judge Doyle casually referred to certain defendants as "those types," and once wrote, "A firm hand keeps their kind in check." A collective gasp swept through the crowd. Reporters scrambled to tweet. Citizens watching live across the country stared at their screens, stunned not only by the content, but by how long it had been allowed to continue. "This," Malcolm said firmly, "is not justice. It is a betrayal of the oath every judge swears to uphold." But he wasn't done. With calm resolve, he announced the following. A formal ethics complaint had been filed with the state judiciary. A motion to suspend Judge Doyle was in progress. A federal civil rights lawsuit would be filed on behalf of dozens of affected individuals. A request had been submitted to the Department of Justice to review statewide sentencing disparities in similar jurisdictions. Behind him, supporters began to gather. Former defendants, local activists, legal professionals, and even a few retired judges who had quietly arrived to witness the moment history changed. Malcolm didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He ended the conference with one line that echoed far beyond that courthouse lawn. When justice becomes selective, it stops being justice, and we the people cannot afford silence any longer. Then he stepped away from the podium, leaving behind a stunned crowd, a shaken system, and a new national conversation about what fairness truly means. That day, headlines didn't just report a press conference. They marked the beginning of a reckoning, and the man who had once been humiliated for arriving late had just shown up right on time for the truth. Just days after Malcolm Reed's shocking press conference rocked the country, the ripple effects began turning into waves. The courthouse that had once been a symbol of routine authority now stood at the center of a firestorm. But what no one expected, even Malcolm himself, was that the people would rise faster and louder than the institutions ever had. It began with a phone call. A coalition of civil rights attorneys from across the Southeast, some of whom had spent decades battling discriminatory sentencing, reached out to Malcolm. Inspired by the evidence he presented, they had begun compiling a list of former defendants who had appeared before Judge Franklin Doyle over the last 15 years. Dozens had already come forward voluntarily, recounting eerily similar stories: excessive bail, harsh sentencing for first-time offenses, demeaning language from the bench, and many were poor, Black, or Latino. Within a week, the coalition filed a class action lawsuit representing 63 former defendants, alleging a clear and consistent pattern of racially motivated judicial abuse and demanding both damages and sweeping institutional reform. The case was titled Williams et al. D. The State of South Carolina, Judge Franklin Doyle et al. The lawsuit was unprecedented, not just in size but in what it targeted: the very structure that had allowed one judge to operate unchecked for years. But the most dramatic moment came in a packed courtroom 2 weeks later. Judge Doyle, now under suspension but still publicly defiant, had shown up to a procedural hearing flanked by lawyers and political allies. He smirked confidently as cameras flashed and reporters called his name. He still believed he could ride out the storm. Then the clerk stood up and said 5 chilling words: "Your Honor, you've been served." A federal summons, signed by a U.S. District Court judge, was handed to Doyle in front of the entire courtroom. He paled, glanced down at the envelope, and for the first time looked genuinely afraid. Inside were 3 charges. 1. Willful violation of judicial ethics. 2. Systemic abuse of authority under color of law. 3. Deprivation of civil rights under federal statute. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Cameras captured every angle. Doyle's attorneys rushed to his side, but the damage was already done. The image of a once powerful judge being handed a summons in open court went viral within minutes. And standing quietly at the back of the courtroom, unseen by most, was Malcolm Reed. He didn't smile. He didn't celebrate. He just watched, silently, steadily, as the scales of justice finally began to tip. Because this wasn't about revenge. It wasn't personal. It was about what happens when the people who were silenced find their voice together. And for the first time in a long time, the courthouse floor didn't belong to the row behind the bench. It belonged to the people who had been dragged before it for far too long. In the months that followed the lawsuit and federal summons, the state of South Carolina witnessed something few thought possible: a public reckoning, not just with a single judge, but with an entire judicial system that had long operated without accountability. And it began with the fall of Judge Franklin Doyle. Under mounting legal pressure and damning public evidence, Doyle resigned from the bench in disgrace. The resignation was swift, but not silent. His carefully crafted legacy unraveled in national headlines, court memos, and televised debates. What had once been dismissed as isolated incidents were now fully exposed as part of a pattern of institutionalized bias stretching across more than a decade. But this story wasn't just about taking down a man, it was about rebuilding what he had broken. Following Doyle's resignation, the state judiciary, under pressure from the Department of Justice and a growing public movement, initiated a series of sweeping reforms. 1. Independent Oversight Commission. A nonpartisan judicial review board was created to monitor judges' decisions for patterns of racial or socioeconomic bias. The commission included former judges, civil rights advocates, and community leaders, with the power to investigate and discipline active judges. 2. Mandatory bias training. All sitting judges in the state were required to undergo training in unconscious bias, racial equity, and cultural competency, something previously only recommended. For the first time, judges were being asked to learn about the communities they served, not just rule over them. 2. Mandatory bias training. All sitting judges in the state were required to undergo training in unconscious bias, racial equity, and cultural competency, something previously only recommended. For the first time, judges were being asked to learn about the communities they served, not just rule over them. 3. Public access to sentencing data. A new transparency law was passed requiring court systems to publish anonymized sentencing and bail data by race, income, and charge. Citizens could now track disparities in real time, giving watchdog groups the tools to hold the system accountable. 4th, Restorative Justice Fund. A fund was established to compensate those harmed by Doyle's rulings, people who had lost jobs, homes, or opportunities due to unjust sentences. Malcolm Reed personally advocated for this measure, ensuring that justice was more than symbolic, it was tangible. For many in Greenville and across the state, these changes felt like the first real breath of accountability in years. The courthouse, once a place of fear and silence for so many, had become a symbol of transformation. Malcolm never claimed credit. When asked by a national news anchor how it felt to have taken down a corrupt judge, he simply replied, "I didn't take anyone down, I stood up, and a lot of people stood up with me." Indeed, what made this victory lasting wasn't one man's investigation. It was the voices of the community, the courage of witnesses like Mrs. Helen Carter and Officer Daniel Hayes, the support of civil rights attorneys, and the bravery of dozens of ordinary people who refused to be silenced. The legal textbooks may remember this case as a landmark class action or a judicial ethics scandal, but for the people of Greenville, it would always be something more intimate. The moment their voices cracked through the marble walls of the courtroom and demanded to be heard. And for Malcolm Reed, it would forever be a reminder that justice isn't a destination. It's a practice, a daily choice, a quiet stand. And sometimes all it takes to fix a broken system is for someone, just one person, to say, "This isn't right," and refuse to sit down again. Because when justice is truly restored, it doesn't just punish the guilty, it begins to heal the innocent. Long after the lawsuits were filed, the judge resigned, and the courtroom cameras were packed away, one quiet moment still lingered in the minds of those who followed Malcolm Reed's story. It wasn't the televised press conference, the class action lawsuit, or even the moment Judge Doyle was served in open court. It was a single question, spoken softly in a tense courtroom, that changed everything. Are the rules in this room applied equally to everyone? At the time, it may have sounded simple, modest, almost rhetorical. But that question, delivered not in anger, but in quiet defiance, marked the beginning of a seismic shift. It was the spark that lit a path toward justice, not just for Malcolm, but for dozens of people who had once believed their voices would never matter. The lesson was never about vengeance. It was never about destroying a man's career or shaming an institution. It was about accountability, about using truth as both a mirror and a tool. And perhaps most importantly, it was about the power of speaking up, even when you're alone, even when the odds are stacked against you. For seniors, veterans, and all those who've lived long enough to see the tides of history shift, Malcolm's story carries a deeply personal message, that your voice doesn't lose value with age. If anything, it grows stronger. It gains clarity, wisdom, perspective. And when that voice is used with purpose, calm, steady, and rooted in what's right, it can change not only policies but people. We live in a world that often rewards volume over virtue, noise over nuance. But Malcolm proved that sometimes the most courageous act is to ask the right question at the right time, and then be willing to follow where the truth leads. Because real change doesn't always begin with a rally or a headline. Sometimes it begins with a single person in a quiet courtroom, refusing to pretend that unfairness is just the way things are. And for every person who has ever been dismissed, overlooked, or told their experience doesn't count. This story is your reminder. You don't need to shout to be heard. You need to stand firm, ask bravely, and never underestimate the impact of your voice when guided by truth. Because one brave question can echo further than you ever imagined. Injustice, when it truly arrives, often walks in the footsteps of those who dared to ask it first. Malcolm Reed's story is more than just a tale of legal drama. It's a timeless lesson about dignity, accountability, and the enduring power of one voice. In a world that too often rewards those who shout the loudest, Malcolm reminded us that real strength doesn't always wear a uniform or carry a gavel. Sometimes it walks softly into a room, listens carefully, and asks the one question that no one else is willing to speak aloud. For many older adults, retirees, veterans, grandparents, this story resonates on a deeper level. You've lived through eras of injustice, seen the rise and fall of systems, and watched society change around you. You know the cost of silence. You understand what it means to be overlooked or underestimated simply because you don't match someone else's idea of power or relevance. But like Malcolm, your experience is your authority. Your calm presence carries wisdom that the world needs more than ever. What Malcolm teaches us is that we are never too old, too small, or too outnumbered to make a difference. You don't have to lead a movement to move the needle. Sometimes all it takes is standing up, respectfully, firmly, and saying, "This isn't right." In today's world, where institutions still struggle with fairness and inclusion, your voice matters. Whether it's advocating for better healthcare, calling out injustice, or simply reminding your grandchildren of the values you've lived by, your story holds weight. You are not a bystander in this chapter of history. You are a keeper of perspective, a bearer of truth, and often the first to recognize when something just doesn't feel fair. If Malcolm's story spoke to you, if it stirred something in your memory or reminded you of a time you stood quietly but firmly, comment the number 7 below. And if you believe others need to hear this message too, share this video so more people can witness the power of quiet courage. Stay with us, because our next story might just be the reminder you've been waiting for. That even now your voice still matters, and justice still listens.